The Harvard Graduate School of Education, working at the nexus of practice, policy, and research.
I think we're ready to begin, so thank you. I'm Kathleen McCartney, Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker. It's a pleasure to be hosting Kerry Kennedy, who is the president of the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights. As all of us who are here know, Kerry has continued the proud legacy of her parents, Robert and Ethel Kennedy, in advancing civil and human rights. She's been doing this since 1981, when she began her activism investigating human rights abuses committed by U.S. immigration officials against refugees from El Salvador. Since then, Kerry has led over 50 human rights delegations to countries including Haiti, Kenya, the Sudan, Pakistan, Vietnam, and China. In 1988, Ms. Kennedy established the RFK Center, a nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting social justice and protecting the rights codified under the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights. As part of that effort, she met with human rights activists from across the globe whose courage in the face of persecution and overwhelming opposition inspired her book, Speak Truth to Power: Human Rights Defenders Who Are Changing the World. The book features interviews with high-profile leaders such as the Dalai Lama, along with conversations with lesser-known defenders such as Anonymous, a Sudanese activist who requested that even his or her gender not be disclosed for fear of reprisal. Speak Truth to Power has spawned a play, a photo exhibit, and a set of pioneering curricula that help students from middle school through college learn about human rights and take action to become defenders of those rights themselves. Kerry Kennedy is the chair of the Amnesty International USA Leadership Council, and she serves on the boards of directors for Human Rights First and the United States Institute for Peace. She's the best-selling author of Being Catholic Now: Prominent Americans Talk About Change in the Church and the Quest for Meaning. As you may know, she's a graduate of Brown University and Boston College Law School. Please join me in proudly welcoming Kerry Kennedy to the Harvard Graduate School of Education, Askwith Forum.
Thank you very much. So I have a couple questions. First, do I need to stay here because of the filming, or can I walk around?
I think you can walk around.
Okay, great. And thanks. And can you guys come forward? All of you people in the back, let's have a more intimate gathering in the front. Thanks. So while you're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about our adventures. This is Orlando Quiroga, who came up from New York with me today, and we're going to go back later tonight. And we had a little trouble parking when we came here. And remind me of a friend of mine who had lost his job during the recession, and he got a job interview at 57th and 5th in New York City at 9 o'clock in the morning. He lives near me in Mount Kisco, so he got up at 6 and he drove down to New York, and he started looking for a parking space, which if you've been around there, it's even worse than here in Cambridge. And he was driving around 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 8:30, 8:45, no parking space. And at about 10 of 9, he pulled over and he said, "Dear God, please help me find a parking space. If you do, I promise to go to church every Sunday for a year." And just at that moment, miraculously, right underneath the awning of the place that he was supposed to pull in, a parking space opened up. And so he pulled in, and he was getting out and putting some money in the meter, and he looked up and he said, "Never mind, God, I found one myself." So I tell that story because I think we should all be grateful for all the gifts that we've been given, and even if we don't feel that way all the time. So people sometimes ask me why I became involved in human rights, and I have 7 brothers. And when you grow up with 7 brothers, you get a keen sense of the importance of human rights at a very young age. So my earliest memories are when my father, Robert Kennedy, was the Attorney General of the United States at the height of the Civil Rights Movement, and my uncle was president at the time. And my parents did not separate their home life from their business life, so there were always civil rights activists at our house playing games with the kids, and we constantly went down to see my dad. And my mother would typically put 6 or 7 kids in the back. I also had 4 sisters, so 6 or 7 kids in the back of her convertible, and 2 or 3 dogs and a football. And we would go down to the Justice Department and see my dad, and we would go and run around there, play with him a little bit. And then our favorite thing was to go in the bottom of the Justice Department. There's a tunnel that brings you over to the FBI. And in the bottom of the FBI building, you could watch the sharpshooters at practice. So has anybody here done that before? No. Oh, well, actually, it's open to the public, so a lot of people do. But anyway, that's what, I don't know if they still allow it now, but they did then. And we had a lot of fun doing that, pretending we were spies and looking at the sharpshooters. And now, at the time, the director of the FBI was J. Edgar Hoover. And he had said publicly that he had 3 enemies in life. One was a guy who used to work for him, and they split up. So he was not a friend anymore. And then another was Martin Luther King, and the third was my father. My father was his boss at the time. So J. Edgar Hoover was a man not known for his sense of humor or his love of children. And anyway, so we would be in the bottom of his building, and now this is the weird part of the story, which is there was a suggestion box in the bottom of that building. And so, I know, weird, right? So, so my mother took out her telltale red pen one day and created a suggestion, put it right in that box. And then she gathered up all those kids and dogs and football and started moving us back up to my father's office, which took her a little bit of work. And meanwhile, a very astute FBI agent went and took that suggestion and read it and brought it up to J. Edgar Hoover. And then he had it sent to my father's office, so that when we were walking back into his office, he was reading the suggestion. And it said, "Get a new director." So, yeah. So a little delayed response there. But anyway, this was an important early lesson in the importance of speaking truth to power and women's empowerment. So let's see, after one of those journeys to the Justice Department, my father wrote me a letter, and I have it on my wall in Mount Kisco, and it says, "Dear Kerry, today is a historic day, not only because of your visit, but because today, over the objection of the governor to African Americans, were allowed to register at the University of Alabama. It happened just a few moments ago, and I hope these events are long past by the time you get your pretty little head to college." That was written on June 11, 1962. 62, I think, 62. So a lot of things changed, some good and some bad, by the time I got my head to college. But then throughout my childhood and early adolescence, or late adolescence, I guess, I had an incredibly idyllic, fabulous childhood, except for some things. And there's a handful of things that happened which were so egregious and terrifying and horrible. And I didn't know, I was just confused about how to deal with them, how to grapple with them, how to understand them. So first, my uncle was assassinated, as you all remember. And then Martin Luther King, who's a good friend of our families, and of course, leader for our country, was killed. And then my father was assassinated. I was 8 years old at that time. And then when I was in 5th grade, a friend of mine who's a family friend, the daughter of a family friend, came to me and said that her father was beating up her mother. And these are people at our house every weekend. And I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know what to say or how to protect my friend. I didn't know how to protect this woman who I loved. I didn't know how to think about the man who I also loved, and how is it possible that he's doing that? It was very, very difficult. And then when I was in high school, two of my best friends were raped by 2 men on a double date with guys they'd just recently met. And then another friend of mine died from AIDS. He was one of the youngest, earliest people in the United States to die from HIV/AIDS. And he was gay, but he wasn't out of the closet. And he wasn't out of the closet because the repression of people who were gay, lesbian, transgender, transsect was so oppressive at that time. So all of those things weighed on me. And I couldn't figure out what to do about them. And then when I was a sophomore in college, I got an internship at Amnesty International in Washington. And I was documenting abuses committed by US immigration officials against refugees from El Salvador. And in the course of that work, I had this extraordinary revelation, which is that there's something in the world called the International Declaration of Human Rights. Sounds like puppies are being tortured next door. Is that possible?
I think they're using the catering cart.
I see, okay. Well, either that or the catering cart. So I learned about the International Declaration, and I learned that everything that was a source of confusion and chaos for me had something in common. Everything was a violation of international human rights. And there were laws against it. Somebody had written them down. The United Nations had written them down. And there's a whole slew of people around the world, lawyers and activists, who every day were working to protect those rights. And they could teach me how. And there was a way out. And that was so transformative for me. Such an extraordinary revelation. And that's, we just had this discussion with Kathy and several of you in this room about Speak Truth to Power, the RFK's human rights curriculum, and why we have it. And there's a lot of good intellectual reasons, but that's really the heart of why we do it. So that kids, students who are in chaotic situations, who are in places of oppression, either within their schools or within their homes or within society in general, can say, my gosh, it doesn't have to be this way. There's a way out. There are professionals. I can learn to do this. I can create change. I can be part of something larger than myself. And that's what we're trying to do. Now, I imagine, I might be wrong about this, but I imagine that that's what you're all trying to do too. Because why else become a teacher? If not to open up worlds to students and empower them, and by doing that, give them some sense of freedom that's otherwise not accessible. And that's, when I think about my best teachers, that's what my best teachers did for me. So, Amnesty. The thing that was amazing, that was a personal revelation to me, an amazing experience. But the other thing that happened is I learned about refuseniks in Russia and anti-apartheid activists in South Africa and the mothers of the disappeared in Chile and El Salvador. People like me who were trying to change their government's policies, like I was trying to change our immigration policies. And they were being imprisoned and tortured and threatened with death for it. I was able to go home and go out to dinner with my friends. So I gained this incredible appreciation for our country, because we live in a country that's born of revolution, where institutions are capable of change because of citizen activism. They won't change if we don't act. They will change if we do act. So that was an incredibly important lesson for me. And then, as I've worked in human rights over the last 30 years, I came to understand that there are these people who are the kind of the Davids in a world full of Goliaths. But the Davids ultimately win. And I say that because when I started working in human rights, all of Latin America was under right-wing military dictatorships, virtually all of Latin America. And today, virtually all of Latin America is under democracies. At the time, South Africa was under apartheid. Today, South Africa has had a series of freely elected governments elected by a majority of their people. And at the time, all of Eastern Europe was under communism. And today, there's not a communist ruler left except for possibly Putin. But, you know, I mean, basically, they're not under communism, does not rule per se in that part of the world. Look at what's happened. Marcos was in the Philippines. There was a military dictatorship in South Korea. Look at the openness in Cambodia was under the Khmer Rouge. I mean, go around the world and the openness that's happened in China. So there's a lot that we have to do. At that time, also, women's rights was not on the international agenda. In fact, it wasn't until 1995 that Hillary Clinton went to China, to the women's conference there, and declared women's rights are human rights. That is her most famous quote. Why is that famous? Because it was revolutionary in 1995 to say women's rights are human rights. Imagine that. That is not very long ago, right? And now the Women's CEDAW, which is the Women's Rights Convention, has been ratified by 183 countries. So all those changes happened, not because governments wanted them to, because governments tried to stop them, and not because militaries wanted them to. In fact, great armies tried to stop them. And not because huge multinational corporations wanted them to. In fact, often it was multinational corporations that tried to stop these changes, but because small groups of determined people harnessed the dream of freedom and made it come true. And that's another message we gotta send to our students, because that's really what creates change. And people need to know that. And you know, in a way, sort of thinking that that a government, only the government has the power, or only the military has the power, only the multinationals have the power, or they have the power, somebody, not me. Politicians have the power, governments have the power. That's a very, very, very empowering message for them to have, right? Because that means the rest of us say, oh, I can't do anything about it. But the truth is, we can do something about it, and we're threatening if we come together and say, this isn't right, I'm gonna make this change. So it's so important for the next generation to know that and understand it and believe it. And that's up to all of us as teachers to convey that message. I then spent about 10 years working in human rights, and everybody, when I would say I work in human rights, people would run in the opposite direction because they thought, oh, that's going to be, she's going to start talking about torture or something horrible. So but that was not my experience at all in this work. So I spent about 2.5 years, and I traveled around the world, and I interviewed leading human rights defenders about their work. And I asked them about courage, and where does it come from, and is that something you're born with? Is it something that can be taught? How do I give that to my 3 daughters without having them have to live in an oppressive society? And the answers were varied and very, very moving. So, for instance, I talked to Elie Wiesel, who I'm sure everybody here has read Night. He survived the Holocaust as a child. And he said, my dream for the future is that your children won't have my past. And Archbishop Tutu, who was one of the leaders of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and he said, we don't have a God who says, ah, gotcha. We have a God who lifts us up and dusts us off and tells us to try it again. And those, to me, are sort of the bookends of human rights. On the one hand, trying to stop the oppression. And on the other hand, having this faith in the capacity of the human spirit to triumph, even under the worst of circumstances. And one of the people who I interviewed is a woman called Digna Ochoa. And Digna is a nun. She's a nun, a woman, and an Indian, and she's from Mexico. And I asked her, she's one of the leading human rights defenders in that country, and I asked her why she became involved in human rights. And she explained that she comes from a community, very small community, very isolated community, and there was only one factory in the town, and her father was a union organizer. So whenever they would have a strike, the owner of the factory, instead of dealing with the labor issue, would just call the police, and the police would come down and round up all the union organizers and throw them in jail and often torture them. And so she spent many years not seeing her father, and when he would be returned, you know, he'd be beaten up. And so she said, I wanted to be a lawyer for people like our family. And I said, well, tell me about how a typical case works. And she told me this story. She said, well, somebody came to our office just a few days ago. A woman came and said that her husband had been disappeared, had been picked up by the federal judicial police and taken away, and they refused to say if he was alive or dead or whether they were holding him or not. And so I said, what'd you do? She said, well, we heard a rumor that he was at a military hospital not far away. So she said, I went to the hospital, but they wouldn't let me in. So I said, what'd you do? She said, well, I waited outside until there was a shift change, and then I walked past the guards. And she said, she went up to the second floor, and she looked around, and there was one door with a nurse sort of sitting as a sentry outside it. So she walked on up to that nurse, and the nurse said, you can't go in here. I can't even go in there. The desaparecido is in there. The disappeared guy is in there. So Digna thought, okay, now I know where my client is. She was feeling good about that, but she was scared because she knew on the other side of the door would not only be her client, but some of the people who had beaten him so badly that he had to be hospitalized. And so she said, I opened the door, and with all the authority I could muster, I said, you get out of here right now. This is my client, and I'm his lawyer, and I get 5 minutes alone with him. And they left. So she signed him up as, as the lawyer, and now she could go get a habeas corpus decree from a judge. So she was feeling good about that. And she was walking back down the hall, and around the corner came the two guards, and they came at her in a very threatening way. So I said to her, so what did you do? She said, I didn't know what to do, so I assumed the attack position. Hey! And one of the guards said, you're going to attack us. And she said, take it any way you please. And she said, I didn't know karate. I think I saw that in a movie somewhere. I was trembling inside, but they left. And it gave her a chance to pull herself together and escape. And after that, I asked her to reflect on that moment. I said, where does that courage come from? And I don't know what I was expecting, maybe something about love or Jesus or redemption. She was a nun, so she didn't wear a habit, but she wore very conservative clothes and a big cross. And she spoke very softly like this. And what she said really surprised me. What she said is, I'm just so angry. I'm so angry when I think about what these people have done to me, to my family, and to my country. And I gather up all that outrage, and it gives me this very, very strong sense of calm inside with which I can confront anyone. And I think, that reminded me of the ancient pyramids that were built by slaves in Giza. And there's graffiti in them that's 2,000 years old, and it says, no one was angry enough to speak out. And I think what Digna is saying is we've got to speak out when we see injustice. And that's true for all of us. We have to speak out. And we're constantly being told not to do that in many, many different ways, not to be angry, not to speak out. This happens to all of us, but it especially happens to women. Who here has ever heard someone say, oh, you're not angry when you feel angry? Anybody? Yeah, people are smiling. Yeah, that happens, right? So I'll tell you this story that happened a few years ago. I have twins, and so they were getting their first Holy Communion, which is the most terrifying thing that happens to you as a Catholic. Not the communion part, but before you go to communion, you have to go to your first confession and go tell the priest all the sins you've done, which as a 7-year-old, how many sins could there be, right? So our priest wanted to help the kids feel a little bit more sure when they went to the confessional, so he wrote up a list of possible sins they could confess. And, they mostly followed the 10 Commandments. I was rude to my mother. I, took my sister's toy, something like that. But then towards the bottom, there was an 11th, and it said, I got angry. And so I said to the priest, anger is not a sin. Anger is an emotion. And he said, would you like to go to confession, Kerry? So I share that story because I think it's kind of funny. But the truth is that we're always being told that, especially as women. Oh, you're not angry. And there's an institutional reason for that. Because anger, we all know it can be destructive. But it can also be a source of revolutionary change. And you gotta accept that anger when you feel it if you see something that's not fair. And we need to teach our kids. We were talking earlier today about K through third graders and how they say all the time, that's not fair. That's good. It's good for them to know that's not fair. But then we don't want to just leave it, come back to that and say, well, why? And how does that make you feel? And what are you going to do about it? Because we want to train people to identify their emotions and then use it to create a world that is fair. And that's so important. So I want to share with you one other story, and that is from Marion Wright Edelman. Well, I'll tell you that story, and then we can do Q&A, right? Is that good? Okay, so you know who Marion Wright Edelman is? Almost, this is such a great audience. Love that. Okay, so she was the first woman and the first African American to pass the bar in Mississippi. And she did that in the 1960s in order to defend civil rights activists like Martin Luther King and John Lewis and others. And she said that at a certain point, all of us have to open that envelope in our souls, take out that little piece of paper that tells us what we're supposed to be doing here on earth. And she said, I was blessed at a very, very young age to find a cause that to me was worth dying for. And that's made every day of my life worth living. And so I can tell you as a mother, that's what I want for my daughters. I want them to find a cause that makes every day of their life worth living. Now, it might be social justice, or it might be painting a beautiful picture, or it might be something else. But there's got to be something. And I think that's our quest as parents and as adults, and especially as teachers. What we want to do is help that next generation, that classroom full of kids, find that thing that makes every day of their life worth living. And in almost all the cases, it's going to be something that makes them help their community. It's going to be something that has to do with service. That is what every religion says, and that is what our lives tell us. So I leave you with that thought, and I'd be happy to have a discussion. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the thing is that I'm a Catholic, and I grew up with God and saints. And saints were so high above us. They were all statues, and we put them all in stained glass. And, you know, we were no longer challenged by them because they were so impossible to reach. But these are living, breathing human beings with all the failings of all the rest of us. We absolutely don't want to say to people, you have to be perfection before, you have to win a Nobel Prize and then you can start working on human rights. You want everybody to know that all of us, with all of our failings, with all of our problems, have something to contribute. And that's a really important lesson. So, yes, yeah.
Two-part question, I guess. One is, could you say a little bit more about whether you see any difference between the concept of training and education?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for both of those questions. So, yeah, I do see a difference between the intellectual content of teaching people about human rights. You need to do that. You need to say that there are laws, that there's the International Declaration of Human Rights, and that human rights are not just be nice to one another. It's not something from the Bible. It's not something that somebody can just make up one day and say, oh, that's a human right, and that's a human right, and that's not one. They're written down. They're adhered to, or there's failure to adhere to them by different nations. And you can hold people accountable. You can sue a government for failing to protect your rights. So that's extremely important. That's different from training. So you can fill somebody with intellectual content, but they might not know how to actually do it. So what we really try to do at the RFK Center is both give kids the intellectual background, and so I shouldn't say kids, it's really students. So we have programs that go from K basically through law school. So there's obviously different curricula and different activities depending upon the age and capacity of those students. And we also have it in different countries. So we have it in the United States, in Italy, Romania. We have a small program in South Africa, and we have one in Cambodia. And different programs are appropriate for different students as well. But we emphasize training because we believe that to become a human rights defender is you get trained just like anything else that you get trained to do in life. And so we give students exercises they can do, things that you can do in your classroom, your community, and globally on human rights. So shall I give an example? Which we talked about this a little bit earlier today. We have three major programs at the RFK Center. The Human Rights Education program is called Speak Truth to Power. And I have some booklets on that I can give you afterwards if you're interested in it. One of our teachers was an 8th grade English teacher. Most of our teachers are social studies teacher, but this one was an 8th grade English teacher in a school in Long Island that has more languages in that school district than any other school district in New York. And about 90% of the kids are on school lunch, maybe a higher number. So she gave out the first day, she had to teach poetry, and she gave students information on Robert F. Kennedy, who was the senator from New York, and on kids in child labor and slavery in the chocolate business. So 70% of chocolate consumed in the United States is the cocoa beans are picked by kids in child labor or in slavery. And so she gave them information on this, and the students had to write poems in iambic pentameter to Robert F. Kennedy from a kid in child labor. So it's teaching about poetry, teaching about New York State history, teaching about empathy, all in one lesson. And so they wrote these letters, and they are absolutely beautiful and incredibly powerful. And I think in part because almost all those students came from backgrounds where their families came from very oppressed backgrounds, which is why they fled to New York and why they were living in such dire poverty. The kids came back and said, we want to do something more. And so the second assignment was expository writing. And so I always am about to say suppository writing. I always go, God, don't say suppository, don't say suppository. Anyway, expository writing. So they had to write, so she gave them all the addresses, the name and address of the head of Mars and Cadbury and Hershey's. And so they wrote these letters explaining what's going on in the chocolate fields and the cocoa fields, and saying, what are you doing to protect kids? And then the kids said, well, we want to do something else, and this is in the fall semester. So she got 5x8 index cards, and they wrote what is going on in the fields, and they scotch taped that to the index card, and then they said, but there's something that you can do about it, which is buy fair trade chocolate. And then they scotch taped a little piece of fair trade chocolate to each postcard. And then on Halloween, they did reverse trick or treat. So anytime somebody gave them a piece of Hershey's chocolate, they said, thank you very much, and would you like to take this and read it? And so this is a very, very empowering kind of approach. And at the end, those kids all self-identified as human rights defenders. So, we unfortunately don't have scientific data, but hopefully that's going to change. But both the teacher and the principal of that school said that that grades went up, and school participation went up, and absenteeism went down, and bullying went down. So this was not a bullying curriculum at all. This was about child labor in Africa. But it was something that's really speaking to kids' hearts and empowering them, and getting them involved in something larger than themselves. And it made a huge difference in that classroom. So what do? We have 3 programs. One is called Speak Truth to Power, as I mentioned. And that's our human rights education program. And we really try to do both the intellectual piece and the training piece. And our goal there is that all kids self-identify as human rights defenders at the end of that class of study. And let me just go on about that just for a few more minutes. When we see human rights violations, especially massive violations, there are 4 different actors. We see it as the perpetrator, the defender, the bystander, and the perpetrator, the victim, the bystander, and the defender. So the defenders are the guys standing up and saying, that's not okay. So our goal is to get all 3 of those other actors, the perpetrator, the victim, and the bystander, to be defenders. And that's really what the goal of Speak Truth to Power is all about. Now, what does that mean to be a defender? We see a defender as having 2 basic parts to it. It's a combination of bravery and compassion. So bravery is saying, God bless you. Bravery is overcoming fear for something more important. So every student who can remember first grade and left mom behind, or whoever that caretaker was, and stayed in that school, that's somebody who is brave, right? And for those of us who can't remember that, every time you walked into a class and thought, I didn't do my homework, didn't study for this test, and you walked in anyway, then you were being brave because you were overcoming your fear for something more important. Compassion has to do with love for somebody else, with empathy for somebody else, with caring for someone else. So when you combine bravery and compassion, then you are doing something, overcoming a fear for the greater good. Not to accumulate your own goods, but for the greater good. And that's what human rights defenders do. So that's really what we're trying to instill in students. When they look in the mirror, they see a defender. And we talked about this a little bit earlier today, but in my work in human rights, so I've primarily done human rights globally, we see sort of three different types of human rights defenders. The most common is somebody who comes from an oppressed group and fights on behalf of them. So that's like Martin Luther King or John Lewis in the civil rights movement, or Archbishop Tutu Mandela in South Africa would be typical of that. The second, and that's almost all of them are that. Then the second group, also quite common, is the I need to come up with a better word, so I'm looking for one. But it's a parachute, somebody who parachutes in. So that would be like me. Or, that's somebody who comes from a society that has nothing to do with what's going on in the society where they're trying to create change. So if an American goes to Mexico or goes to Uganda and works on something, that's what they're doing. They have no dog in the fight beforehand, and they parachute in and start getting involved. The third type is the rare, absolutely the most rare form, and that is somebody who comes from the oppressive community and risks being ostracized by their friends and family and their community in order to take on some social justice goal or some human rights goal. That would be somebody being white in South Africa. And that doesn't happen very much. But who's called on to do that more than any other group? Are students. Because students face that every single day. Because each day when they hear the word bitch or slut or fatso or retard or whatever else they're hearing, faggot, they have to make a decision every time they hear that. And they're hearing it 10, 20 times a day, something like that. Somebody being teased, somebody being hurt, somebody being picked on, somebody being laughed at. And they're making that decision over and over and over again. Who am I? Am I the perpetrator? Am I the victim? Am I the bystander? Am I a defender? So I think what we need to do is give them that power right there, right then, and help them make the right decision, help them make the decision to be the defender, because they're exercising that muscle. They're exercising one of those 4 muscles all the time, and they're making that decision all the time. And every time they exercise the muscle to be a perpetrator, that's somebody who's going to continue to be a perpetrator. And every time they exercise the muscle to be a victim, that's somebody who's going to continue to see themselves as a victim throughout the rest of their lives. So we really need to help them see themselves as defenders, because that's the only way to make a healthy and happy person and a strong society and a true democracy for our country and all the good stuff that needs to happen. Second 2 programs, and I'll do this quickly, is we have one program where we work with the financial community, the heads of sovereign wealth funds and large endowments and pension systems. We usually have about 75 people at a conference who control between $3 and $5 trillion in assets, which is China's economy is 4.6 trillion. So there's a small number of people with enormous amount of power. And we talk to them about the impact of the impact of human rights violations, environmental degradation, and governance, which is basically corruption, on their investments, on their investment outcomes. So we're not saying you should do this because it's the right thing to do, but because it's the financially responsible thing to do. So should I give you an example of that? Okay. So an example is, do you remember the Massey Energy mine explosion, 2009? Okay, so most of you remember that. In West Virginia, Massey Energy had a mine. They had 97 safety violations in the 30 days before that mine exploded and killed 27 miners, and with it destroyed the environment. So massive human rights violation, 27 people dead, huge environmental degradation, and then all of the pensioners, the teachers, the policemen, the firemen lost their retirement savings because it went down with the mine. So who's in charge of making the decision to invest in that? That's the heads of pension funds, which are usually the state treasurer, an elected position. And you know, depends on the system you're in, but everybody here who works either has or will have a pension, and somebody's going to be investing that for you. And you want to make very, very sure that they are investing in something that's not going to be a Massey mine that's going to explode and lose your pension. So in that case, everybody lost their money, and others lost their lives. So what we're saying to them now, if Massey comes back to you and says, will you invest in our other mine, you have a duty to ask them, what are you doing about your safety violations? Because last time we got burned on this, so what are you going to do now? And not only look at the financials, but look at the human rights and environmental and other issues. BP is another example of that. So there's a lot of them, and we work with those pension systems to help them figure out how they can, in a practical way, make this work. And then the third program is called RFK Partners for Human Rights. And at RFK Partners, we identify people who are the Martin Luther Kings of their countries, leading human rights defenders. And then we partner with them for a 6-year period, and we help them realize their social justice goals. So if they are, we don't go to a country and say, you have a bride burning issue, or you have a freedom of expression issue, or you have a trafficking issue. We go and it's really people oriented. So we're looking for the person who has a history of success, who was there long before we got there, who's going to be there for the next several decades. And then we partner with that person, and we say, where do you want to be 6 years from now, and how can we help you get there? So we might do a lobbying campaign in Congress or at the United Nations with them, or we might help them build a board of directors and a more rigorous, professional, excellent NGO, or we'll do whatever it is they need in order to be successful. So it's a very long answer. Sorry about that. Yes?
Hi, I'm Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
I'm a master's degree candidate
Oh, good.
in museum studies here at Harvard.
Uh-huh.
So my question is, you earlier outlined how the world is a better place than it was 50 years ago,
30.
30 years ago, and I appreciated that summary. However, I wonder what you can suggest we would do here at home to protect our own rights to happiness, which is a constitutional right, because the government seems to continue to spend the money on the defense and security, the threatening nature of government life, rather than celebrating, as Canada does perhaps, the health and happiness and culture and education of their people and subsidizing that. So that's a very dear cause to my heart, and I wonder what you would suggest what we could do here at home to protect our own human rights
Okay, well, thanks.
against our government.
Right. So I'm glad you raised that issue, because you do not need a passport to work on human rights, although many people think you do. You don't. There's plenty of work to do here at home. And you know, military spending is one of those issues. And how do we divide the pie? Who pays more taxes? What do we do about access to health care? Education dollars, which I'm sure is an issue that all of you are deeply concerned about. We have done work on juvenile justice, on equal pay for equal work. I think Equal Pay Day was someday this week. And women still only make 77 cents on the dollar made by men in this country. Mistreatment of people in prison, death penalty, juvenile justice reform, all of these are all examples of issues that are important to address in the United States. There are a lot of great organizations working on them, from Amnesty International to the ACLU, to church groups that are particularly good on that issue, on military spending, join all of those, and if any or all of those, whatever speaks to you in particular, that's what I would say you should do. And go to the RFK Center website if there's, we can use all the help we can get, but there's a lot of groups out there that are active on all of those issues. Yeah.
Thank you for inspiring work about the realizing the international human rights frameworks, but I also wonder whether the work that you've done has implications for revising those frameworks. I mean, they do periodically, like the Millennium Development Goals or some of these things. And I know there's sometimes skepticism about, the power of the framework by itself, though your entire career and your work are about the fact that the UN human rights framework, the vision of that is a powerful driver for change. But so I wonder whether you have thoughts on what are the implications for the next generation of whether it's the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the UN human rights framework. If that's something that you
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that, thanks for that good question. Yeah, we are constantly struggling to make the international human rights framework more rigorous and stronger and expansive. So as we were saying earlier, CEDAW wasn't on the international agenda. Today it is. Today it's been ratified. The rights of people with physical and mental handicaps is now wending its way through the United Nations. So we endorse that and we work on it and we help others who are working on it. So there's a whole plethora of issues. Terrorism was not the biggest issue 15 years ago. After 2001 hit the United States, it became a huge issue on the international agenda. So those are some examples of it. I can tell you something that we've been working on. The UN conventions on human rights are divided into two different groups. The Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and then there's a group that's political rights. So political rights are things that we talk about here in the United States a lot, and they're very similar to our own Bill of Rights. So it's things like the right not to be tortured, the right to due process, the right to free expression, the right to vote. And if any of those are violated, you can sue somebody. You can bring them into court and you can sue them. It's not that easy to do, but at least you have the right to do that. So those are some of the rights. Economic, social, and cultural rights are the right to water, the right to health care, the right to education, and those are looked at as aspirational. Beware when you hear the word aspirational, because that means you can't sue. And if you can't sue, you can't hold somebody accountable, and therefore they don't really give a damn about making sure you have that right. So one of the things we're working on is how do you make those justiciable? How do you make it possible for people to sue on that issue? Now, one of our human rights defenders is called Lune Vio, and she works in Haiti with Partners in Health, Paul Farmer's group. I'm sure you guys are familiar with him because he's a great hero from this institution. So we said, what do you want us to do? And we'll work with you for 6 years. Well, get the water turned back on, make sure they don't turn the water off again. What's this about? Well, it turns out that they had gotten the government of Haiti had gone to the Inter-American Development Bank, which is like the World Bank, only it's local to the Americas, and said, we would like loans to build a water treatment facility in this rural part of Haiti. And those loans came forth, and they built this great water treatment facility. But then Aristide came to power in Haiti, was back from exile, and George Bush became president of the United States. The Bush administration didn't like the Aristide administration and changed the position of the United States was no federal money can go to the government of Haiti. Now, when Loon said to us they turned off the water, we can't figure out how to turn it back on, we then went to the State Department, to the White House, to the Congress, trying to figure out why is this water not being turned on? Why is the IADB not sending back the loans to keep the water treatment facility going? We ended up filing a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act, and we got a pile of documents that's, I would say almost the size of this middle section here of chairs, maybe about as tall as I am. And we got about 20, 25 law students, and they went through every single one of those pieces of paper. And eventually we came to the smoking gun, which was an exchange of emails from the White House to the head of the IADB, and saying, the White House saying, turn off the loans and turn off the water, stop the loans, turn off the water, and the IADB saying, well, we are not allowed to tie, it's against our charter to tie development loans to politics, and emails back saying, stop the loans, turn off the water, and stop sending emails. And so we then brought a lawsuit against them, and they reinstated the loans and turned the water back on. And meanwhile, the kids who died in that intervening period were known as IADB kids. I mean, it was such a clear, there was such a clear connection between turning off the water and the waterborne diseases that they were dying of. Hundreds and hundreds of them. And this is criminal activity, criminal. And so what happened? Now there is the first lawsuit holding a government entity responsible for the right to water. And we did that on this legal theory, which is that let's see, what's it called? Do no harm. So if they're in a tort case, if there is a doctor and she's going down the highway and she sees a car accident, she has no duty to stop, right? But if she stops and she amputates the wrong leg, you can hold her accountable. So it's that same theory, which is you don't have a duty to provide the water, but if you're going to provide it, you can't then do harm by turning it off or by making it be poison or something like that. And so this was successful. Now that can be used in all of these other cases. It's not just about water, but you can use that theory for education or for healthcare or for other things. So that's the type of work we typically do. Yeah.
I've got two questions. One is a positive one, one more negative perhaps. The first question is, of all the work you've been doing in the last 30 years, what are you most proud of? And the second, more negative one is, we live in a world of intractable conflicts and a number of violations of rights. Which one do you think is least likely to resolve? About which one are you most pessimistic?
So what I'm most proud of is, the most far-reaching is probably like the case I just described. But the one that makes me most proud every time it happens is when somebody who's tortured gets out of prison. Somebody's life gets changed. That's, and it's not always on the specific human rights issue. For instance, Orlando and I this morning had this incredible experience, which is there is a guy called Emil Carmendez who was the leading human rights defender in Guatemala in the 1980s, up in Quiche, and where the government there, with the backing of the United States government, burnt to the ground 400 indigenous villages and slaughtered 30,000 people. It's just a horrible mess. And so he was up there defending it, and I went there back and forth a lot at that time. But then then that conflict was resolved, and we moved on to other places in the world. And I got an email maybe two and a half months ago, something like that, saying that he had a brain tumor. And there was no doctor in Guatemala who could help him. And it cost $50,000 to get the operation. They had raised a couple of thousand. Could we help? So we made some phone calls, and UMass agreed to do the surgery for free. And so that happened 17 days ago, and today we went to Somerville and visited him, and I was expecting to see a guy in pajamas, in bed. And in fact, what happened is about half of Quiche, Guatemala, moved to Somerville, apparently. So there's a whole community. They don't speak English and they don't speak Spanish. They speak Mayan. And all this great Mayan food. Then we went to the house this morning, and there were about 25 people there. And it was great. I mean, really very, very moving. Really sort of tangential relationship to human rights, but that's what it's about. Just really when somebody's life is a little bit better because of something you did. That's what makes me feel good. The most intractable problem to me is also the one that is where I've seen a lot of change, which is women's rights. I think that that's that's the most important human rights issue in the world, because it's something that impacts every human being on Earth, and either directly or because that's your mother or your sister or your daughter or your wife. And it is, if you, anywhere in the world, if you really want to see if you can make a dramatic change, and you can only do one thing, the one thing you should do is empower women, because that has enormous impacts, as anybody here who's ever looked at this at all knows. And so that's great, and that's important, but still 1 out of every 3 women is sexually assaulted during her lifetime. In the United States, 1 out of every 3 Native American women is raped during her lifetime. Here, 1 out of every 5 girls is sexually assaulted by the time she's 18. I mean, 1 out of every 5. How about that? And I mean, we won't go through all the statistics, but it's grim, and there's a long way to go. Yeah?
You mentioned about partnering with human rights defenders in different parts of the world. Speaking truth to the power in those places is not without risk.
Right.
You mentioned Digna.
Yeah. Yeah.
And sadly, in 2001, she was found dead
Yeah.
in her office.
Yeah.
With multiple gunshots.
Yeah.
And they left a note saying whoever continues her work face similar
Yeah.
circumstances.
Yeah.
So the question I have is, in your work, working with human rights defenders in other parts of the world, what have you found effective strategies minimizing the risk so that these human rights defenders can speak to the power,
Mm-hmm.
bring hope places there is no hope,
Mm.
or give voice to the people who have no voice, but minorities, indigenous people in different parts. And it still will not end up like technology.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that about Digna, because I think of her so much, and I miss her so much. And I was actually in Mexico last week, and with a group of human rights defenders, and she is an extraordinary woman. She made an enormous difference even 10 years later. People really look to her. So what do you do? One thing that we really try and do is listen to what the defender says. If a defender says, stay away from me, we stay away. So I find that they know best how to protect themselves and what they need to be protected. That said, the thing that usually helps protect defenders is international notoriety. So there's a reason that you don't see winners of the Nobel Peace Prize being knocked off, whereas you might see their colleagues being knocked off. And that's because the international spotlight is on them. So that's generally, just as a general rule, that's what helps. But it's interesting, as you were asking that question, I was thinking of a discussion we had earlier today about bullying and about how the real way to stop bullying and all human rights violations are in some way bullying on a different scale, right? Is you create communities. You create communities of empowerment and justice where people believe that there is a system of justice that they can trust, where people feel comfortable speaking out about what they think is wrong and what they think is right. And so the most successful human rights work is when there's some combination of trying to hold the perpetrators responsible, stopping impunity, and empowering the community to be involved in that discussion. So if and that's why if an international organization just plops down and starts trying to create change, they might do it a little bit. They might get one policeman held accountable, or maybe one general, but that's kind of doesn't move the society. You have to do a lot. There has to be a lot of work done by people on the ground that has to do with community organizing at a very base level in many, many ways. Yep.
I have a couple of practical questions.
Yes.
The first one is the curriculum for schools in the United States. Do you actually advise people to do the curriculum? Do they come to you? What is the process? And the second one is that, as unfortunately, social studies is not being taught now in many schools, especially in schools where kids are oppressed. And it's very hard to, the way you describe curriculum now, because they are absolutely dominant. So where do you think you could sort of insert this kind of curriculum in a school that is very concerned about literacy support? I understand bullying is now sort of a popular topic, and may be able to come through that, but when the society is only really interested in scores and achievement,
I know.
your program doesn't.
I know. You're right. Okay, so where can you get it? Go to our website. We have two, Robert F. Kennedy, so rfkcenter.org, or you can go to Speak Truth to Power or Speak Truth. Any of those will bring you right to it. Now, and you can download the lesson plans from there. If you're interested in a richer experience, we have a program called Teach Truth to Power, and if you pull together a group of teachers, we'll send a trainer to your school or your area, and we'll train them. And we do all this as a service. And then how do we disseminate the information? We do it a lot through press and a lot through partnerships we have with different organizations like the Southern Poverty Law Center and teachers unions and others. Now, what do you do in a school where they have that conservative agenda? For one thing, we often will work with teachers who are in math and English departments. So I gave you that example. I'll give you another example. Great, this wonderful math teacher, 8th grade math, another 8th grade teacher. And so there we were working on an issue with farm workers in Florida who there are 10,000 farm workers, and they pick tomatoes, and each barrel of tomatoes has 34 pounds of tomatoes in it, and they want a wage increase of $0.01 more per pound. And and then there's a certain number of pounds that they pick every day. What's a ton? Is that like 2,500 and something? Okay, so that's basically what each one picks per day. And then Goldman Sachs owns a percentage of whatever it was, 40% of Burger King. And Burger King was resistant to the wage increase. And so then there was so Burger King had to hire lawyers to protect themselves against this wage increase. And there was an article in the New York Times, editorial op-ed, critical of this. So then we had the number of bonuses that Goldman Sachs was getting that year. So you can see where this is going, can't you? So this math teacher, 8th grade math teacher, had their students figure out how much would it cost Goldman Sachs to give that wage increase per year to those farm workers, and what would that do to the bonus of the chair of the board of Goldman Sachs. That was the assignment. So it turned out it was $200,000 a year, so which was a good deal for Goldman Sachs. And they actually agreed to it. So that's what happened in that particular case.
Many teachers who teaches subversive activity and not necessarily constrained completely by the prescribed curriculum. But your example sounds like a school where you are allowed to.
Yes, no, absolutely. That would not work in every school. Absolutely not.
And so, anyway,
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's
concerned about your wonderful ideas sort of ramming up against.
absolutely. No, you're right. It's a problem. It's a problem, and it's something that we are working on. And let me just say 2 more sentences, and then Kathy has a comment on that. What I really think, and this doesn't go over well with that group either, but I think that students are human beings, and they need to be treated and see themselves as something more than test takers, especially if they come from particularly oppressive communities. And you want them to come to school, and you want them to feel creative, and you want them to feel involved and that they have a stake. And so that's what I think the value of Speak Truth to Power is. That's the value of this curriculum. And it's not going to be for every school district. And there's going to be a lot of school districts that are going to be really resistant to it, and they are, and they don't teach it. So it's not a huge program right at the moment. And that's part of the reason why. It's very political. So that's a challenge for us. But yeah, Kathy.
Well, we're almost out of time, but I'm going to use my prerogative and suggest that you end tonight by telling this audience a little bit about what you have planned next week with the Chicago Public Schools, because I think they're going to get a preview of what they're going to be reading about in the newspaper.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. So this is so exciting. And my colleagues would kill me for not even mentioning it till the last 5 minutes. But anyway, we have been working for the last 18 months with the Chicago public school system. And we worked with a group of about 20 teachers for 3 days and wrote new chapters of Speak Truth to Power, each based on a different Nobel Peace Prize winner. And on Monday, we have 22 Nobel Peace Prize winners coming to Chicago, and they're going to fan out across the city, and they're going to go to those classrooms, not to huge auditoriums, but to the classrooms where the students have studied them for the last 4 months. And then the students are going to interact. Each student has some project that he or she is doing inspired by having learned about that Nobel laureate. And then we have 3 days of conference where primarily the audience is about 2,000 people. We have 6 heads of state, and primarily the audience are high school students who have studied the laureates, and 15 colleges and universities will also be part of that. And then, of course, we have the hoi polloi of Chicago, and the mayor and the governor and a lot of business leaders as well. And we have a group of 150 teachers, high school teachers, who are going to stay after the sessions have ended with the Nobels, and they'll be trained in 5 different social justice curricula. And they agree to teach those, so it's Speak Truth to Power and Facing History, and 3 that are local to Chicago. And they agree to teach those over the next 5 years. And they are also invited to attend the Nobel Conference. So all this will be live streamed through Scholastic. We have a partnership with Scholastic, and one with the State Department, and one with the Southern Poverty Law Center, and a few other partners. So all these sessions will be accessible. But this program is oriented specifically to students. It is not, and all the Nobels know that's who the audience is. So the name of it is Speak Up, Speak Out for Justice and Human Rights. And it's really the message is that one person can make a difference, and each of us has the responsibility to try. And it's all about trying to get students to feel that they have a stake in our future, a stake in our community, and they're empowered to create change. Yeah.
Kerry, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.